The plaster is now setting up, so I've started shaving it off. And because I was pretty careful when I put the plaster on and didn't put too much excess on, I can cut it down now. And the various things we use for cutting plaster with are things like grapefruit knives are really wonderful. The serration on there it really cuts beautifully. But because it's already pretty smooth, what I can use is one of these wood rasps. They're used a lot for grating oranges and Parmesan cheese, but they really cut the plaster. You can see the plaster coming through, and it gives you a much nicer, cleaner shape. You can cut it down with a knife as well when you need to take really large pieces off. You can see why I'm doing it over the sink now. It's a very messy business. And again, you're just doing it all by eye, and I mean, it's not impossible to go back later and put some filler on. I think we talked about the problem that I hadn't mixed enough plaster up the first time, and now you can see what's happened. The earlier plaster is this white color, and the second plaster has gone slightly gray, which is very characteristic of this happens. And this plaster, because it dried much quicker, the second coat I put on, is much harder, and in fact the rasp is cutting into this one and leaving a little bit of a dip. So that's why it's pretty essential, if you can, to mix up a little too much plaster. The Saran wrap, I hope, is just here to, I'll put a bit more tape on, just to protect the pot and keep it clean. It's more a question of keeping the plaster off it. So at the final stages, you really have to take the Saran wrap and the tape off so that you can really eyeball the curve of the pot. But it looks pretty good already. So it's like wood carving or any other sort of carving at this stage. It's just to minor chips and things that are missing, or I didn't put enough plaster in, or the plaster breaks out, I can go over later, and we can talk about that a little later on. And I use a wood filler which comes in a tube. And it's a little bit softer than plaster, and I can put that on in small quantities, just like filling chips in a chair. So what I'm going to do now is take this off. You can see it's a really messy business cutting up plaster. Lots of people don't like doing it now. So what I'm going to do is just use the back of the knife. It's my favorite kitchen knife. It's quite thick. And I'm going to rest the back of that on the pot so that I can go around here, and as long as I keep the back of the blade onto the pot, I'm not going to cut the pot. But I need to trim the plaster down flush at this stage while it's still soft. You can see now that some problems are coming in with these bars I put in. This one may be a little proud, but when the plaster's gone all around it, when I file it down with a rasp like this, it will cut through the epoxy as well, so that's quite fine. So the rough shaping of the pot looks really quite good. I'll just take a shade off here. These rasps were a wonderful invention, but it's really essential to go over it and just take the edges off the rasp where the rasp has been. You can hear this is getting really hard now, and it's only been on there half an hour. But it's nearly 11:30 now. By 12:30, 1 o'clock, if I tried to file this, there would just be clouds of dust, which really isn't the best thing to be happening in a laboratory. And just to put the final shapes on it, this is really coarse garnet paper. Luckily you can buy it in rolls because you can see what happens, it clogs up really rapidly. But what it does is take out any small bumps. We don't want perfect plaster because the pot's not perfectly smooth, but we just shape it up with that. And it's essential to have a nice smooth joint up to the previous plaster. 50 years ago when I was being trained to do this, my boss would have got really upset about this because he would do the plaster in one whole piece. So if I do that in a circle, it tends to, instead of scratching it, it sort of swirls it around and makes it smooth. So you can see it clogs up the paper. So I switched to a finer grade of paper and just, I'll no doubt have to fill some of these little chips, and I've got 2 air bubbles there that I didn't bang the plaster hard enough. So there we go. We've got a nice, not a perfect finish. It doesn't hurt to leave a few little scratches in it, because if it's too glossy when you paint it up, it really does look, it doesn't blend in well with the pot, I would say. Essential at this stage to really flick this plaster off. There we go. What we may find is that I've got too large a bow in some of these epoxy pieces, and I'm going to plaster up to them just the same, but it may be necessary to file them off or even cut sections out. That doesn't matter because the plaster is taking over now as the strength of the potting and keeping the whole thing intact.